Good evening, everyone. It's a great honor to be asked to give an appreciation of our late Queen at this wonderful event, especially on a night when such an outstanding fellow citizen, Irving Cotler, is being honored for his crucial contributions in furthering human rights in a world that sadly continues to need such heroes. I so wish that I was there with you. I love evenings like this. But my beloved wife of nearly 50 years has been waiting for over 3 months to get surgery on her shoulder. She had a heartbreaking accident when she was on her bike in a bike lane, and an impatient driver became annoyed with a slow driver and floored it, passed on an inside lane and so close to Elizabeth that his side view mirror connected with her brake handle and sent her sprawling to the pavement. With luck, she'll be coming out of some very serious surgery just as you are listening to me, and the only proper place for me is to be as close to her as I'm able. That's why I'm grateful to all of you and the Churchill Society for your forbearance. Our late Queen was also forbearing to a fault, Prince Philip once said, and if anyone should know, it would have been Prince Philip. That forbearance, tied to her tenacity and loyalty to duty and the Constitution, are what marked her unprecedented reign of 7 decades. And by the time she finally decided to take a rest, we all saw how that tenacity and loyalty to duty was appreciated the world over, and not just in the countries where she had constitutional responsibilities. But perhaps before I get too lyrical on the subject, we should acknowledge straight up that through most of her extraordinary reign, Queen of Canada has been a title some Canadians felt disobliged to accord her. It's part of the riddle that is this beloved country, the riddle of exactly who we are, and the riddle of what exactly we want to be. Despite this riddle, Queen Elizabeth rarely made a misstep. She would tell Canadians she was happy to be coming home, and even when she was here during difficult times, she made a point of saying that she was especially happy to be here. "I'm not just a fair weather friend," she once said famously, and it was true. She never sought to avoid the rough days. And there were rough days, none more fraught than in 1964, when Quebec was seething with discontent during the not-so-quiet revolution. It was actually not so much the English Queen that had Quebec separatists in a rage, as it was the entire idea of Quebec still being a constituent part of Canada. On that singular occasion, she endured people booing her and pointedly turning their backs as she and Prince Philip made their way to the provincial legislature in Quebec City. "We don't come here for our health. We can think of other ways to enjoy ourselves," Philip famously said at a subsequent press conference, enjoining Canadians who wanted to end our links to the Crown to go about the business with a modicum of civility. And it was the Queen's own civility that marked her reign. She was in for the long haul, and if we wanted her, she was prepared to go the full distance, even if it took up 3/4 of her lifespan, even if it meant a seemingly perpetual round of unrelenting garden parties and receptions, even if it took an unending speculation on her position amongst us, even when she had to make polite conversation with John Diefenbaker at his most pompous or Margaret Trudeau at her ditziest. Here's the conundrum. Part of the disconnect some Canadians have with the Crown of Canada, even the loyal ones, is to understand that the Queen served as our head of state at the will of the Canadian people. The right to sit upon a throne may be inherited and unelected, but if a federal administration came to office in Canada with the avowed intent of severing the links to the Crown and could get the agreement of all the provincial and territorial legislatures, well, the Crown would end in, well, maybe not a twinkle, I guess, but fairly speedily. You all know, as well as I do, that throughout Queen Elizabeth's reign, whenever there was trouble in the home front, or whenever a former colony decided to embrace republicanism, the commentariat got very excited at the prospect of a crownless Canada. But at the end of the day, when all the chicken feathers and the dust have settled back to the ground, it finally dawns on everyone that it just is not going to happen. Not in my lifetime or any of your lifetimes, or perhaps even the lifetimes of your children. One of the immediate problems is the institution is not as easily disposed of as some think. It requires the consent of 10 provincial legislatures and both the House of Commons and the Senate. I won't even dignify the scenario by suggesting the likelihood of that ever happening in our lifetimes. This is the constitutional part of our relationship with the Crown that escapes those who feel some sort of national shame that English monarchs rule over us. In fact, some of these skeptics eventually come to see that it's wise to stick with the world's only international monarchy because it's a better idea than anyone else seems able to come up with. And I would argue that so far in a country with as many riddles as Canada, it has suited our purposes time and time again. In an interview I once had with Prime Minister Stephen Harper on the subject, he said that, quote, like most Canadians, I was largely indifferent to the Crown, unquote. But then he went on to say that since he held high office, he'd come to see its remarkable value. Even more importantly, he added in a somewhat dark aside, I have looked closely at all the alternatives and they all scare me. So then, herself endured all these ups and downs throughout her life, right up to her extraordinary departure last September. She was our head of state for almost half the post-Confederation history of the country, which means there are only a minority of people left in Canada who remember living under a different sovereign. Although at this particular gathering, perhaps a majority. Maybe I'm wrong. I myself am just old enough to remember how strange it was as an 8-year-old at primary school to stop singing God Save the King every morning. The entire map of Canada is littered with the progress of her family's reigns. Georgian Bay after George IV, Prince Edward Island after Queen Victoria's father, Victoria, BC, Coronation, Alberta, Regina and Prince Albert, Saskatchewan. Well, the list goes on and on. There are actually more than 1,500 place names rooted in the Canadian Crown. Which means what exactly? It means that there is a bedrock history rooted in the Queen's family, and she knew it, just as her son and our new king knows it. Canada was clearly the late Queen's favorite amongst the overseas dominions, and she came here often on both extensive and short progresses around the country, 22 journeys by official accounts. She also understood, as few Canadians themselves do, the strong bond between the Crown and the Indigenous nations, which stretched back, in her family's case, to the court of Queen Anne, which received a delegation of Mohawk chiefs as the kings of Canada and accorded them head of state dignities with an official reception at St. James Palace in 1710. Excuse me. Queen Elizabeth herself never missed an opportunity to connect with the Indigenous nations of Canada, and neither does King Charles. If you go through the archive of photographs of her Canadian reign, they are festooned with endless Indigenous interactions. There has been and continues to be a strange symbiosis between these two estates, as if they each realized that in the strangest of ways, they supported each other's legitimacy, even when some in the rest of Canada doubted the legitimacy of both. Again, this is part of the riddle that is Canada. Most Indigenous leaders know better than most non-Indigenous Canadians the difference between the person of the sovereign and the role of the Crown as government. But then we don't really teach civics and Canadian history to any meaningful extent anymore, content to wallow in a sort of echo culture of our esteemed neighbor, which is certainly a great country still, but you know, they keep re-electing King George III every 4 years to the White House. Whereas we, in the Westminster system, have moved on from the Hanoverian heads of state model to our own unique and more democratic system. As the late and great Professor Ursula Franklin said once at Massey College, when she and Nobel laureate John Polanyi gowned Prince Philip as an honorary senior fellow, she said, "I love having a head of state in which symbolism is everything and unfettered power is utterly defanged." On the whole, the Queen had happy relations with our elected leaders. Her first was Louis Saint Laurent, and then in succession, John Diefenbaker, Lester Pearson, Pierre Trudeau, Joe Clark, John Turner, Brian Mulroney, Kim Campbell, Jean Chrétien, Paul Martin, Stephen Harper, and Justin Trudeau. Commentators have often speculated on who her favorite was, but no one knows for sure because that is precisely the sort of information she never allowed anyone to have. I myself am pretty sure that emotionally it was Jean Chrétien and intellectually it was Pierre Trudeau. In Trudeau's case, it was not particularly because there was almost the same age difference between the two of them as there was between Prince Philip and herself, but because in all the video clips and photographs that I've seen of the two together, she seems more relaxed with him than any of the others. In Chrétien's case, there was even a bit of rough affection. I traveled with Chrétien to England when he took the final deliberations of our protracted constitutional wrangling to Buckingham Palace to brief her prior to her return to Canada to sign it all in Ottawa. He had had quite a few trips during the previous few years on variations of the same mission, and when she saw him this time, he reported that her first comment was, "Not you again." And in that document, which Trudeau presided over and Chrétien saw through its parliamentary paces, it was these two French-Canadian leaders who ended up protecting the office of the sovereign from all the vicissitudes of changing tastes and popularity games underscored by the often hilarious ignorance of most opinion polls. That was done exactly 40 years ago with the Constitution Act of 1982, and I believe they both understood exactly what they were doing. That was because Trudeau and Chrétien knew the difference between intelligence and stupidity, was that intelligence knew its limits. There's also an extraordinary tale revealed just a couple of years ago of how the Queen colluded with Mr. Trudeau to frustrate British Prime Minister Edward Heath's plan to have her boycott a Commonwealth Heads of State and Government meeting in Ottawa, Mont-Tremblant in August 1973. This was officially because of the presence of the dictatorial Ugandan leader Idi Amin. Heath said she shouldn't go because of his presence, but the fact of the matter was that Heath loathed the Commonwealth and was intent on getting Britain into the common market. He made a big mistake, however, because he hugely irritated the Queen. This was not just because the Commonwealth was very dear to her heart, it was also, and perhaps particularly, because his advice was being offered peremptorily and without due consideration of the balancing act she has always had to maintain in her unique position as head of state for other countries within the Commonwealth. Her solution was typically adroit. She parlayed the advice of her British Prime Minister to stay away with the advice of her Commonwealth host, the Canadian Prime Minister, to come. Mr. Heath had to change his own plans and come to Canada with his tail between his legs, and I was told by the late Esmond Butler, private secretary to the Governor-General Roland Michener, that the Queen worked especially hard to make poor Mr. Heath feel at home in her Canadian kingdom, even as she made sure that Idi Amin was expansively cold-shouldered. The constitutional reality is that our Queen only went to places she was advised to go, assented through her vice-regal appointees only to the legislation she was required to approve, honored citizens she was expected to honor, and was altogether the very definition of a perfect and unobtrusive constitutional sovereign presence. If that doesn't mean much to some people, it's only because they have not realized how difficult it was for anyone to endure such steadfastness to an ideal of duty during such a prolonged period of extraordinary national and global change. It can only be because concepts of faithfulness and service have ceased to matter. Most of all, it can only be because they have not pondered how lucky we were that she was there throughout these many years and spared us a mountain of constitutional grief trying to make another system work. That was certainly the view of Sir Winston, who came into her life towards the end of his days, although he first met her, apparently, briefly, when she was only 2 years old. In a letter from Balmoral Castle in 1928, Churchill wrote to his wife that the 2-year-old princess, quote, was a character with, quote, an air of authority and reflectiveness astonishing in an infant, unquote. Despite that early impression, he was said to have been upset after King George died because he thought the Queen was, quote, too young to reign. Churchill's private secretary in 1952 assured the Prime Minister that he would find the Queen intelligent, conscientious, and charming. Churchill wasn't convinced. Quote, I hardly know her, and she's only a child, he is reported to have said. Colville knew better, of course, because he had been private secretary to Princess Elizabeth from 1947 to 1949, and he exactly predicted what subsequently emerged, a strong and emotionally enduring admiration for her sense of duty and her gifts of practicality and accommodation. For her part, the Queen could see well beyond the politics of the day and the declining faculties of the wartime leader. She appreciated his romantic views of the crown, even as she understood better than he did its realities, and she was able to steer him towards a safe retirement, making sure that the nation and the world honored him as the great heroic leader that he was. And now, just as she had to steer her course through a post-Churchillian era, We are in a post-Elizabethan era, full of challenges, snares, escalating dangers with unthinkable consequences. We also have the still vivid memory of what constancy and duty can achieve in the balancing act of human aspiration, and a dutiful king who I can easily predict will continue to be a credit to his mother in all the ways that count most. So again, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your forbearance in allowing me to address you in this way. I hope you're all having a wonderful evening. Thank you so much.